Picture this. A rookie security guard steps onto a Hollywood set, ready to make a good impression, but ends up making the biggest mistake of his life. He tries to kick Clint Eastwood, yes, the Clint Eastwood, off the set. What happens next? Trust me, you won't believe it. Stick around because this one's got lessons, laughs, and a whole lot of drama. Stay tuned. Before we dive into this wild ride, I want to know where you're watching this from. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're ready for one of the most embarrassing and hilarious moments in Hollywood, make sure you like and subscribe, because you don't want to miss this. It was Jason's first day on the job as a security guard at one of the biggest movie studios in Hollywood. The streets were buzzing with energy, the iconic Hollywood sign gleaming in the distance. The studio gates loomed ahead, and Jason could already feel the weight of history and dreams that had been built right behind those fences. Nervous but excited, he slid his security badge onto his belt and tightened the straps of his uniform. It felt heavier than it should, almost like it was testing him. Today wasn't just any day, it was his big break, the one chance he'd been waiting for to prove himself in the heart of the movie industry. Jason had dreamed of this moment since he was a kid, watching movies from the comfort of his couch and imagining what it would be like to be part of the magic that created them. But today, that dream was grounded in reality. He wasn't on the silver screen, he wasn't holding a camera or making the next big blockbuster. He was just a rookie trying to keep the set running smoothly. His job was simple. Patrol the grounds, keep an eye on the props, and make sure the area was secure. Easy, right? Just follow the rules, do your rounds, and stay out of the way. As Jason walked around, trying to look as official as he could, his eyes darted over the crew setting up lights, cameras, and props. Everyone had their own role in this chaotic dance, and Jason felt like a small part of the machine. Still, he couldn't help but think, this is it. I'm part of the team now. He checked the props laid out for the next scene, fake guns, antique chairs, the odd lighting fixture here and there. Everything seemed to be going well, but Jason's mind was buzzing. He was on set with real movie stars. This was Hollywood. That's when he noticed him. In the background, off to the side, sat an older man with a rugged look, his face weathered like he'd spent decades under the sun. The man had a cowboy hat perched low on his brow, and he was speaking calmly to the director. Jason's first instinct? The man was just another background extra, sitting there between takes, probably taking a break. No harm in that, Jason thought. But something about the way the man sat, so confident, so at ease, caught Jason's attention. This was no average extra. Maybe it was the aura around him, maybe the way the crew seemed to gravitate around him as though he was the center of attention, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this guy was someone important. His pulse quickened. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to show that he wasn't just another rookie. He was here to do his job, yes, but he was also here to make his mark. This was Hollywood. And in Hollywood, if you wanted to stand out, you had to act with confidence. Jason straightened up, pulled his shoulders back, and took a deep breath. Time to show them I'm not just some newbie. With determination in his step, he made his way toward the man in the cowboy hat. His mind raced with thoughts. Just do what you've been trained to do. Show them you've got what it takes. As Jason approached, the man continued talking to the director, completely unaware of the rookie security guard walking up to him. Jason swallowed, gathered his thoughts, and said, "Excuse me, sir, you're going to have to leave the set. We need to clear the area for the next shot." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. But hey, it was his first day. He had to assert himself, right? The man didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just kept talking, unbothered, as if Jason wasn't even there. Jason's heart rate quickened, but he pushed forward, thinking maybe the man didn't hear him. "I said you need to leave. This area is restricted to actors and crew only," Jason repeated, his voice a little sharper this time. Still, the man didn't react. Jason was now standing directly in front of him, blocking his view of the director. He waited for the man to stand up or say something, anything. But Clint Eastwood, as Jason would soon learn, just sat there with an air of calm that only added to the tension building between them. Jason had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. But in that moment, his determination was clouded by the pressure to prove himself. With a deep breath, Jason stood a little taller, pointed at the chair, and made his final, foolish declaration. "You need to get up and leave now." Jason stood there, heart pounding in his chest. The Hollywood magic he had dreamed of his whole life was slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of tension. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was just doing his job. But this was more than he bargained for. "Excuse me, sir," Jason said, his voice firm but still respectful, trying to hide the nervous tremor beneath. He'd been trained for situations like this. Approach with confidence, make your request clear. You're going to have to leave the set. We need to clear the area for the next shot. Clint Eastwood didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge Jason's presence. Instead, he just sat there, leaning slightly against the back of his chair, his cold eyes locking onto Jason's with unnerving intensity. The silence between them stretched longer than Jason anticipated. It felt as if time itself had come to a halt. Jason swallowed hard, his confidence starting to waver. But he had a job to do. The rookie guard had to stay in control. I said you need to leave. This area is restricted to actors and crew only, he repeated, his voice slightly more demanding now. Still, Clint didn't say a word. His eyes were like steel, unblinking, unfazed by the rookie's insistence. Jason's hands gripped the edge of his belt, the pressure building as he struggled to keep his composure. This wasn't how he imagined things going. He had expected a little pushback, maybe some argument, but this was a stare that could cut through glass. The silence was deafening. Jason's stomach churned. It was the kind of silence that made you question your every move, your every word. The longer Clint sat there, unmoving, the more Jason felt like he was losing control. He needed to act. He needed to make this right, even if it meant stepping up his approach. I'm gonna have to call backup if you don't leave, Jason said, his words spilling out, not with the authority he'd hoped for, but with the desperation he was beginning to feel. This guy just wasn't listening. Clint, without raising his voice or even a hint of anger, slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Jason's. It was like the world had paused around them. He took a slow, deliberate breath, and the look he gave Jason made the rookie's stomach tighten with discomfort. The intensity of Clint's gaze was almost physical. There was something about it that made Jason feel small, insignificant, like a fly in Clint's world. What did I get myself into? Jason thought. Clint still hadn't said a word, but everything in his posture, everything in the way he just sat there, spoke volumes. He wasn't intimidated, and it was clear he wasn't about to leave. Jason could feel a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Hey kid, Jason said, his tone more challenging now, his frustration starting to boil over. He was walking a fine line, but he felt cornered. I don't think you understand. You don't belong here. The words came out sharp, reckless even. He couldn't back down now. His mind raced with thoughts of how this moment could define him, how he had to show that he wasn't afraid of standing his ground. Then Clint Eastwood, in the calmest voice possible, responded. His words sliced through the air like a blade. You sure you want to do that? Jason froze. His breath hitched in his throat. It was the way Clint said it, calm, yet laced with an unspoken threat, that rattled him to his core. Clint wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. But the simple phrasing of his question felt like an avalanche waiting to happen. Jason's heart pounded. The world around them seemed to close in. His palms grew sweaty as he glanced around, hoping for some kind of support. But no one stepped in. No one moved. It was as if everyone was waiting for him to make a decision, to break, to back down, or to continue. Jason's mind raced. His hands gripped tighter onto his belt. This wasn't just some old man on a set. This was Clint Eastwood, the icon, the legend. The man who had been in more movies than Jason could even count. And here Jason was trying to push him around like he was some random extra. Suddenly, the weight of the situation hit him all at once. People were noticing. Crew members stopped what they were doing and started whispering. They exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others reaching for their phones. Jason could feel their eyes on him, all waiting for something to happen. This wasn't just about the job anymore. This was about respect. And right now, Jason was losing it fast. A few whispers turned into murmurs, and soon Jason could hear people talking behind him. Some were curious. Others were starting to giggle, as if the tension had turned into something almost comical. But the worst part was the feeling of being trapped. He couldn't back down now, but how could he possibly keep going against Clint Eastwood? Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Jason's. The rookie's every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to pretend this whole thing hadn't happened. But it was too late. The standoff had begun, and Jason realized he might be in way over his head. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jason was too lost in his own world of frustration to notice that the situation was about to take a sharp turn. His mind was racing with thoughts of how to save face, how to keep his composure, how to get Clint out of the way and not make things worse. He was about to call for backup when, suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke his concentration. Jason turned his head to see Mark, the head of security, walking briskly toward him. Mark's eyes flicked from Jason to Clint and back again, his brow furrowing with immediate concern. It didn't take long for Mark to sense that something was off. Jason. Mark barked, his voice sharp and tinged with disbelief. What the hell are you doing? Jason, caught completely off guard, spun around to face Mark. His heart sank into his stomach as he realized he had just been caught in the act. His face paled as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This guy, he was just sitting here like he belonged. I told him to leave, Jason stammered, desperately trying to justify his actions, though he knew it sounded ridiculous the moment the words left his mouth. Mark's expression went from surprise to one of utter disbelief. Do you even know who this is? His voice had softened, but there was a clear edge of frustration now. He crossed his arms, glaring at Jason as if he were speaking to a child. Jason blinked, completely lost in the moment. His mind was too foggy with the adrenaline to fully comprehend what was going on. Just some extra? Jason said, his voice uncertain, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Mark let out a long sigh, a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. His hands went to his hips, his shoulders slumping as if he had just received bad news. This is Clint Eastwood, you moron, he said, his voice low but filled with irritation. The star of the movie. The man you're practically asking to leave your set. Jason's world came crashing down in that instant. His heart raced, his blood drained from his face, and his mind went blank. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? The living legend of Hollywood? He had been so caught up in his own mistaken sense of authority that he hadn't even noticed the obvious signs, like the fact that no one else seemed to be questioning the man's right to be there. Jason's mouth went dry and his stomach twisted into knots. He felt the heat of embarrassment rush to his face. His eyes widened as the weight of Mark's words sank in, and everything around him seemed to slow down. I'm sorry, Mr. Eastwood, Jason blurted out, the apology rushing out of him like a flood. He was fumbling, unsure of what to say or how to fix this mess. His voice cracked under the weight of his mistake. I didn't mean to, I didn't realize. But Clint, completely unfazed, didn't even look up from his script. He remained cool and collected like the seasoned professional he was. His face showed a mix of annoyance and amusement, an expression that only Clint Eastwood could pull off. This isn't how I planned to spend my afternoon, Clint muttered under his breath, his voice almost too soft to hear. He didn't seem angry, just resigned. As if this kind of thing was an all too familiar occurrence for him. He flicked a glance at Jason, and that single glance told Jason everything he needed to know. Clint wasn't mad at him, but he sure as hell wasn't impressed either. Jason stood there for a moment, frozen, his face burning with the intensity of the embarrassment he felt. It was as if his entire body had been drenched in a bucket of ice-cold water. All the confidence he had mustered in that moment, his bravado, had disappeared in an instant. Now all he could do was stand there like a fool, completely exposed. Mark, still shaking his head, glanced at Clint with an apologetic look. I'm sorry about this, Mr. Eastwood. Jason's new and, well, we all know how it is with the rookies. Mark's voice was polite but carried an edge of professionalism, trying to smooth over the mistake. Clint didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence, paired with that cold, deadpan look, made it clear that no apology was necessary, at least not from him. The message had been sent. Jason had made his mistake. There was no need for Clint to rub it in. He just let the awkwardness hang in the air as thick as smoke. Jason's head was spinning. His mind was still grappling with the sheer absurdity of the situation. He had just told Clint Eastwood, Clint freaking Eastwood, to leave the set. It felt like something out of a bad comedy movie. Except this was no movie. This was real life. And he was the punchline. I'm really sorry, Mr. Eastwood, Jason mumbled again, now utterly defeated. He tried to hide his red face, but it was impossible. Every crew member on set was now watching him, and Jason could feel their eyes boring into him, each one silently judging him for his colossal blunder. But Clint Eastwood, ever the professional, simply flipped through his script without even sparing Jason another glance. His calm demeanor never wavered. And as Jason stood there, feeling like the smallest person in the room, Clint muttered one last thing that would haunt Jason for the rest of the day. Kid, next time know who you're talking to before you try to kick him off the set. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a scolding. It was just a simple piece of advice, delivered with Clint's usual understated style. But to Jason it felt like a dagger to the heart. The legend had spoken. And Jason, well, he'd learned the hard way that in Hollywood, even the smallest mistake could turn into a public spectacle. As Clint turned his attention back to his script, Jason finally allowed himself to take a deep breath. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was a moment of learning. And as he stood there, wishing he could crawl into a hole and hide, Jason realized that this was probably the last time he'd ever forget who someone was on a movie set. Jason's stomach twisted in knots as the weight of his mistake pressed down on him. His face burned with embarrassment, and for a moment he couldn't even bear to look around at the crew who were still watching the aftermath unfold. He wanted to shrink, to vanish, to sink into the floor and disappear. It felt as though the entire world had turned its gaze on him, and he was helpless to escape it. He had just insulted Clint Eastwood, one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. The man who had shaped the film industry with his legendary roles and unrivaled presence. And Jason had just told him to leave the set like he was any random extra. How could I be so stupid? Jason thought, his head spinning. This wasn't a mistake that could be easily undone. But Jason wasn't about to let this moment completely destroy him. He still had a job to do. He still had to face the consequences of his actions, but he needed to at least try to salvage some shred of dignity. He swallowed hard, and despite the lump in his throat, he took a step closer to Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, I am so sorry," Jason said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I didn't recognize you. I didn't mean any disrespect. Please let me make it right." He knew there was nothing he could say to fix the damage he'd done, but it felt like the only thing left to do. He had to try even if it seemed pointless. Clint, who had remained stoic throughout the entire exchange, sighed deeply, not out of frustration but something else, perhaps just a quiet resignation. He didn't raise his eyes from his script, but Jason could see the slight shift in his expression. There was a flicker of something there, something between amusement and exhaustion, but there was no anger in Clint's demeanor. Clint took a slow breath as if gathering his thoughts before he finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but with a weight of experience that Jason couldn't ignore. "You'll get used to it, kid," Clint said, his tone never wavering. "In this business, you learn fast who's important and who isn't." He paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air before adding, "Next time, know who you're talking to before you start throwing your weight around." Jason's face flushed deeper. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was a quiet lesson, delivered in Clint's signature no-nonsense style. It stung, yes, but in a way that Jason knew would stick with him for a long time. Clint wasn't angry with him. Clint wasn't even making a big deal out of it. But the weight of the moment, the way Clint spoke so calmly as if he'd seen this happen 1,000 times before, drove the point home harder than any shouting match ever could. Jason stood there, his feet rooted to the floor, still feeling like he might pass out from the humiliation. He nodded, his eyes downcast, unable to look Clint in the eye anymore. He couldn't. He wasn't sure if it was out of respect or because he couldn't bear the intensity of Clint's gaze. Maybe it was a mix of both. The crew, who had been standing around and watching the whole interaction, began to disperse, their quiet murmurs fading into the background. Some of them shot Jason sympathetic glances, others seemed to find the whole thing a bit amusing. But no one made a big deal out of it. It was as if everyone understood that in Hollywood, you either learned quickly, or you were left behind. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he took a step back. He wasn't sure what to do next. Should he stay? Should he walk away? The silence stretched, and for a moment he thought he might actually implode from the sheer awkwardness of it all. But Clint, ever the professional, didn't make things worse. He just went back to flipping through his script as if the whole thing had never happened. He gave Jason no more attention, no more words, just a simple return to his work, an indication that this moment was done. It was over. Jason took another deep breath and turned to walk away, his legs feeling unsteady like he might collapse. But as he walked, a small part of him began to think, maybe this wasn't the end of everything. Maybe it was the beginning of something different. He'd learned a hard lesson, but at least it was one that would stick with him. By the time he reached the door, he still felt humiliated, but he also felt a little lighter. Clint Eastwood had let him off easy. He hadn't gone on a tirade. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply delivered a lesson, one that Jason would never forget. As Jason stepped out into the hallway, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He'd made a mistake, a huge mistake, but the world wasn't over. He could still learn. He could still improve. And if nothing else, Jason knew that he would never, ever make that mistake again. As Jason turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief wash over him. The worst of it seemed to be over. Sure, he had made an absolute fool of himself in front of Clint Eastwood, but at least Clint hadn't completely torn him apart. There hadn't been any shouting, no outburst of rage, just that cold, unforgiving stare. Maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten off easier than he deserved. And for that, Jason figured it was a win, right? His steps were slow as he moved toward the exit, his mind replaying the events of the day. Each moment felt like a film in slow motion. Him striding toward Clint, the shock of Mark's reprimand, Clint's impassive stare, the stinging words of advice. It was all so surreal, yet it was burned into his memory. But just as he reached the door ready to slip out and hide from the world for a while, Clint's voice cut through the air. "Hey kid." Jason froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wasn't sure if Clint was addressing him or someone else. He hesitated, turning slowly, the knot in his stomach tightening again. Clint was still sitting there, his legs crossed casually, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a mocking grin. No, it was something different, more like an acknowledgement. "Don't sweat it," Clint said, his voice light but firm, the coolness of his demeanor still intact. "You'll learn. Just remember, next time, don't try to kick Clint Eastwood off the set." Jason's breath caught in his throat. There it was again, the Clint Eastwood brand of advice. Simple. Direct. A little dry, but there was no malice in it. It almost felt like Clint was telling him, "You're not the first to make this mistake and you won't be the last." Jason's nerves gave way to a nervous laugh, a mixture of relief and humiliation. "Thanks, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little shakier than he'd intended. Clint just nodded once, his smirk still lingering for a split second. Then, without another word, he turned his attention back to his script, flipping the pages as if nothing had happened, as if the whole scene had never even taken place. There was no lingering tension, no dramatic pause, just Clint Eastwood back to work as though the encounter had been as insignificant as a passing breeze. Jason stood there for a moment longer, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure if he should say something more, but the moment had passed. Clint had already moved on, leaving Jason standing in the wake of his own mistake. Taking a deep breath, Jason turned and walked away, a little slower now, reflecting on the events of the day. He felt lighter, but there was still a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just about the mistake. It was about what he had learned, the hard way. In Hollywood, respect wasn't something you could demand. It had to be earned. And you didn't just go around making assumptions about who someone was. Not here. Not with people like Clint Eastwood. As he walked down the hall, Jason couldn't help but chuckle to himself. Maybe it wasn't the ideal start to his career, but he had gained something valuable today, an understanding of the way things worked behind the scenes. He couldn't erase the image of Clint's cold stare from his mind, though. That would stay with him for a long time. But in a way, it wasn't such a bad thing. It reminded him to be humble, to stay sharp, and most importantly, to never forget who's who in a business that thrived on reputation. By the time he reached the exit, Jason knew one thing for sure. His first day on the job hadn't been about triumph. It had been about survival. And he had survived it, bruised ego and all. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. But the lesson? That would stick with him forever.